especially those who have that kind of capability or education, or they can become after that program officers who could build a whole skill formation program within NREGA. There are other aspects as well, for example, the role that NREGA has played in developing a whole series of new transparency measures that are now being extended to other programs as well. For example, the MIS, I don't know if any of you have seen the MIS that was developed for NREGA, the Management and Information System. It's really quite impressive. You can see on the internet at the click of a mouse every single payment that has been made to every single laborer across the country. So everything now is not only available on demand, as applies to other information as well under the RTI, but it's also being proactively displayed on the internet so that anyone who wants can look at the data without having to ask for it. Another example of the process value of NREGA is financial inclusion. We keep talking now about financial inclusion, and in fact a whole new program has been launched for this purpose called, what is it, Right. But actually, the fact is that most people in India now already have accounts, if not bank accounts, these post office accounts, thanks to NREGA. It's because of NREGA that most people in India now have a bank account or a post office account. That you will never see mentioned in the business media. I've never seen the business media giving any credit to NREGA for enabling people to have a bank account. So what I'm trying to illustrate is that there are a lot of, aside from the employment and asset creation objectives, there are a lot of potential process benefits in NREGA. People participate in Grand Sabhas, the administration learns how to implement a complex program, we set in place new transparency norms. Workers also have a chance to get organized. This is a very important aspect of NREGA. That, under the unorganized sector in India covers about 93% or more than 90% of the workforce. So almost the entire workforce in India is unorganized, at least in rural areas. NREGA, at least in the initial scheme of things, was very much seen as an opportunity to enable people to organize and to learn to defend their entitlements, not just within NREGA itself, but also their entitlements to the PPS, to minimum wages from the private sector, to pensions, and a whole range of other things. So there are many things that we could build around NREGA if it really worked the way this is supposed to work. Now you can ask, okay, you can say, all right, this is fine, but why do we need a law? Why can't we just have a big employment program? Isn't that going to serve the purpose? And I think the short answer to that is that we need a law because we want the state to be accountable to people. We want people to have legal entitlements that they can defend as a matter of right. Now, of course, in practice, the sad truth is that the legal system in India is not working very well, and especially not working for poor people. It's an interesting fact that in almost 10 years of implementation of NREGA, not one NREGA worker has gone to court to enforce their rights. So it's not that people are going to go to court, but it does create legal entitlements that become hard for the administration to refuse. And also, NREGA has some inbuilt accountability provisions that are aimed at creating accountability within a legal framework, even if people are not able to go to court. I'll come back to what these accountability provisions are, because this is a very important feature of NREGA, which needs to be given much more attention. Now, what about, okay, so it's a law, so what about the content of the law? I'm not going to go into detail because I think most of you know the basis of NREGA, so there's no need to repeat that. But very briefly, the entitlements of the workers under NREGA are first of all work on demand. If you demand work, you're supposed to get work within 15 days on local public works. Secondly, the minimum wage, or more precisely the prescribed wage, because initially it was the minimum wage. Whatever was the minimum wage applicable to the state in which you were working, you were entitled to earn under NREGA. That was reversed later on by the central governments, which exercised its powers under the Act to prescribe the wage. So now it's actually the wage prescribed by the central government, but it's still an entitlement. You have an entitlement to a certain kind of minimum wage. Thirdly, payment within 15 days, which is very important because NREGA workers are typically poor people who can't afford to wait for very long for their wages. Fourthly, worksite facilities, basic worksite facilities, including drinking water, shade for periods of rest, first aid, and if there are at least 5 children under the age of 6 years, then also some kind of creche facility, or at least a woman worker has to be deputed to look after these children. And fifth important entitlement is the unemployment allowance. If you're not given work within 15 days, then you're supposed to earn an unemployment allowance. I think you already know all this. There are all the entitlements also like compensation, the regularity, and so on, but I don't want to go into those. How is it supposed to happen? Well, briefly, the basic unit of implementation is the block. So within the block, there are basically 2 processes happening in parallel. There is a process of work application where people apply for work, and then there is a process of planning of works where the implementing agencies, especially the Gram Panchayats, because the Gram Panchayats are the main implementing agency, but also other implementing agencies, if applicable, like the line departments or even NGOs, they also make proposals for work, which are supposed to be consolidated by the program officer at the block level, who is a kind of BDO for NREGA, and he or she consolidates all these proposals into what is called a shelf of projects, and then starts sanctioning works as and when people demand work. This is at least the way it's supposed to work. Now, coming to the accountability provisions which I mentioned earlier, which are, as I said, are very important, there are at least 3 very important accountability provisions that are built into the Act. One is the unemployment allowance, which I've already mentioned, that if you're not given work, then the state has to give you an unemployment allowance. Now, don't forget that the wages are paid by the central government, but the unemployment allowance is paid by the state government. So that creates an incentive for the state government to implement the program, because if it doesn't provide work, then it has to pay the unemployment allowance. In that sense, it's a kind of accountability provision. Then there's a provision for compensation if you are not paid within 15 days. So if you're not paid on time, you're supposed to be compensated for it. And thirdly, there's a penalty provision, section 25, which says that any officer who doesn't do his or her duty under the Act can be fined up to 1,000 rupees, which doesn't sound like a lot, of course, it's not very much. It's not a big financial penalty, but nevertheless, what we have found in the few cases where that section has been invoked and used is that the government officers are terrified of being fined. And they do everything they can, including going to the High Court, to avoid the penalty. I think partly because they are afraid of the loss of reputation, and partly, more importantly perhaps, because they are afraid that this will go into their service records. So despite the amount of fine being relatively small, it is a section that could have a big impact in terms of creating the accountability if it were used much more widely. So all this is the theory, if you like, of how things should be happening. In practice, of course, as you all know, it's not happening always the way it should be. The record actually has been very uneven between different states. Some states have done very well, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, Rajasthan, Tripura, Sikkim. A number of states have really done what I consider to be wonderful work using MGNREGA, and then many other states, even Chhattisgarh actually, which is important to mention because Chhattisgarh is very close to Jharkhand and shares many features with Jharkhand. So the fact that Chhattisgarh has been able to implement the program in very large measure is an important lesson for Jharkhand. And then there are states like Jharkhand where it's actually not happening the way it should be, and where the results have been much more limited. In places like Jharkhand, despite all these entitlements being in place, what we are seeing is that it remains a constant struggle for the workers to secure their rights. They have to struggle to get work, they have to struggle to be paid, on time, they have to struggle to get the minimum wage. At every step, they still have to fight against a system that is not responsive to them. And I think that there are a couple of reasons why it has been such a difficult struggle. One is that there's a kind of contradiction or at least a tension in the Act which arises from the fact that these provisions that I mentioned, the unemployment allowance, the compensation rule, and the unemployment allowance, all these provisions that are meant to create accountability and to penalize the authorities when they don't respect people's rights. These accountability provisions are supposed to be implemented by the same agencies, the same BDO, the same district collector, who is supposed to activate these accountability provisions. And as you can easily guess, the state authorities are least interested in making themselves accountable. They will respect the law to the extent that they have to, but they are least interested in activating provisions of the law that will hold them accountable. So as fast as they can, almost all the state governments have been ignoring the unemployment allowance, the compensation provisions, and the penalty clause, with some exceptions, including in Jharkhand. But by and large, these accountability provisions have been sidelined and undermined. And then there's another deeper contradiction to my mind, which you can see especially in states like Jharkhand, which is that, to put it perhaps in a slightly simplistic manner, this is a pro-worker law that is implemented by an anti-worker system. What I mean by anti-worker system is that, now of course there are many good people in the administration, stuff like BDO or BDC or BDC is hostile to the workers. It's not like that, but there are also many good ones and we work with some of them. But by and large, the administration comes from a class of people who have a tendency to rationalize their own privileges and to blame the victims for their predicament. It's basically kind of a defense mechanism, because if you're a BDO and if you really believe that people have the rights that the law says that they have, then you don't sleep anymore. You spend all your time addressing people's problems and work day and night to implement the law. So there's a tendency to blame people like saying, law काम करना नहीं चाहते हैं, दारू पीते हैं, find all kinds of excuses for not doing what you're supposed to do. So the way this was reconciled, so you have on one hand these workers with certain entitlements, and then you have an administration which is kind of not really interested in doing much for people, but knows that it has certain legal obligations, and of course is trying to find a way of getting something from the program. And the way all this was reconciled in the initial years, certainly in the case of Jharkhand, was the so-called PC system that I'm sure you know about. PC is percentage. So basically the way it worked is that the technicals, the contractors, who are not supposed to be part of the program, contractors are not supposed to be involved in Nigeria, and today they largely disappeared, but initially they were still very much there. So they were implementing the program. They were fudging the muster rolls, putting big names or inflating the amount of work that people had done. So for example, if you had done 10 days of work, I had 10, 20 days in the muster roll, and then I pocket the difference, and I shared it through the PC system with the different functionaries, the BDO, the junior engineer, the Panchayat Sevak, and so on. So basically everyone was getting a little bit, something from the program, and so there was a kind of accommodation. But of course a lot of waste of money also, and a lot of money that could have been used to provide people employment and to build creative assets was misused. So that was not an acceptable situation at all. Over time, even in places like Jharkhand, which are not very well governed at all, we do see a lot of improvement, because step by step new safeguards were put into place. For example, the system of cash payments, which makes it very easy for the contractors to siphon off money and to share it with the functionaries through the PC system, was replaced with the system of bank payments or post office payments, where the money goes straight into the accounts of the workers instead of being paid in cash by the implementing agency. Now that of course is a very strong safeguard against corruption, because it means that the money goes straight into people's accounts, and so the only way you can siphon off money after that would be to have some kind of scam involving the workers themselves, because the workers, they are the ones who are getting the money. So you can still try, of course, to have some kind of understanding with them, कि ठीक है भाई तुम 10 दिन का काम करो, मैं 20 दिन मिलता हूँ और जो extra है मिलके बांटेंगे. You can still try to do this kind of thing, but it's much harder than the kind of fudging of muscles that was happening initially. So that was one thing, and then there were many other transparency safeguards. There was this building of this huge MIS that puts all the information automatically in the public domain. There was a requirement of mandatory social audits and so on. So the program became gradually tightened, because after all, in spite of everything, in spite of the lack of interest of the administration in the program, ultimately people have some sort of bargaining power in the democratic system. They can demand, they can go to the sarpanch and ask for them to activate work. The media can help to hold the state accountable to its responsibilities. So there are various ways in which one can put pressure on the system to implement the program. So there was an effort over time to tighten the program and to eliminate corruption, which has been to some extent successful, not fully successful by any means, but successful to some extent. But this tightening of the program and this introduction of a whole range of transparency measures has created new problems. Because what is happening now is that firstly the system is becoming very complicated. Not only there are bank payments and social audits, now there are also e-muster rolls, now UID is also sought to be introduced in the system. So there are all kinds of complications that are being introduced as the system is being tightened. Along with that, there is a kind of loss of motivation also, because the functionaries and the middlemen who used to be involved basically because they were getting something from it. Some of them are now losing interest because it's becoming harder and harder to make money. And if you make money now, there's a serious risk of being caught. There could be a social audit, there could be an inquiry, there could be something or the other. And if you are caught, you get in trouble, you may end up in jail and so on. So there's a kind of danger that with the tightening of the system and the reduction of corruption, there might be a loss of motivation and interest on the part of many functionaries. I think that is one thing that helps to understand why in a state like Jharkhand, the scale of the program has quite drastically reduced during the last 2 or 3 years. So the challenge now is to bring back some life in the program, to recreate some motivation and incentives among these functionaries without allowing them to siphon off funds from the program. How much more time do I have? 10 minutes? Yeah? Okay. So I'll end by mentioning a few steps that could be taken to revive an IGA and to make sure that it works better and that it achieves its potential much more in a state like Jharkhand. Again, in the background of this problem of loss of motivation and the growing complexity and tightening of the system. Thank you very much. Now, I suggest 4 broad steps that I think are very important at this time. One is to simplify the system. I think the idea has become too complicated. If you look back at the law, and in fact even at the initial edition of the operational guidelines, the understanding was very clear that MGNREGA was an enabling law. It was not going to be implemented by the central government, it was going to be implemented by the state government, and every state government was going to be allowed to have its own employment guarantee scheme. So there would be Jharkhand employment guarantee scheme, the Maharashtra employment guarantee scheme, the Tamil Nadu employment guarantee scheme, of course all within the framework of the law. The law is the law, and it's a national law. But within that law, every state was supposed to have its own scheme and to devise its own systems to ensure that the law is implemented and that people's rights are realized.